Today we continue our look at ancient religion, and this time we're looking at the spread of monotheism, and specifically how ancient trade routes removed mountains in the spread or diffusion of monotheism. So we've already talked about syncretism, how in a lot of places in the ancient world, religious beliefs, cultural traditions blended together to create a new whole. These cultural traditions or religious traditions traveled primarily along trade routes, and in the ancient world that's going to be, again, primarily the Silk Roads. But you also got diffusion of ideas, or in other words, movement of ideas that don't change when they come into contact with new ideas, but rather are adopted wholesale. So in our look at monotheism, its development and diffusion, we're looking at a concept that doesn't change as it's transferred from place to place, but rather remains intact. We'll begin with the earliest of the monotheistic traditions, which is, of course, Judaism. Now, the roots of Judaism are still a little bit unknown, but if we look at both the Quranic tradition as well as what archaeology is beginning to demonstrate, then we know that the people who eventually become known as Jews originated as a Semitic group from who we call the Hebrews. Now, according to biblical tradition, one of these Hebrews was called to lead his tribe, his people, away from the civilization in Mesopotamia and towards a promised land. Now, traditionally, this man is known as Abram, and as he leads his tribe, what we find in the archaeological record is, in fact, a demonstration of movement of people kind of along the Fertile Crescent and coming in to settle in the Near East. Now, according to biblical tradition, when Abram agrees to settle down and pledges his tribe to the worship and service of God, then he gets a new name, Abraham, the father of many. We believe that this sort of transition occurs sometime around 2000 BCE. And this promise that Abraham made, this contract with God, is what we call a covenant or a sacred contract. And that's a biblical term to indicate the relationship between humans and God. Now, the story of the Jewish people is, of course, recorded in the Torah. Now, what we know is that after a period of time in the Near East, in the Promised Land, the Hebrews come to be known as Israelites. Israel meaning he who struggles with God. And so these are God's people, but they struggle in their service to God. But if we're looking at them and comparing them to other peoples, other ancient peoples of this time, they're very similar. They practice agriculture, they settle down, they have livestock, which they tend, and they by and large get along with the other tribes, the other groups that live in the Near East. Now, what we know is that over time, there was probably some sort of climactic shift in the Near East. This seems to be borne out in some archaeological evidence. And so what happens is that some Israelites, but not all of them, make the decision to travel south into Egypt. Egypt, of course, was very well known for its fertility. They've got the Nile and very fertile grounds there along the Nile. And so the Israelites moved down to Egypt and began farming alongside the Egyptians. And for a while, this was fine. But again, over time, the leaders of the Egyptians, the pharaohs, decided that they didn't like these foreigners in their lands. And so rather than allow them to stay or have them become subjects of the pharaohs, instead they enslaved the Israelites. So this is what we hear in the biblical tradition, and there is some kind of scanty evidence for possible enslavement of foreigners in the Egyptian historical record. The pharaoh who makes the decision to enslave the Israelites is Ahmose. Now, thanks to the Egyptian predilection for mummification, there's a picture of Ahmose for you right there. Now, over time, one of Ahmose's descendants, Seti I, makes a further designation towards the Israelite slaves. And rather than allow them to continue to grow in population, he decides to issue a proclamation calling for the death of male children. Now, what Seti probably meant was that all newborns, and that was usually male children between the ages of newborn and 2, were to be killed. What he intended to happen, most likely, was to create an imbalance of the sexes within the Israelite community. And so you would have lots of females, and if these females wanted to marry and have children, they'd have to marry an Egyptian. Now, unfortunately for Seti, from the Israelite perspective, family and, in fact, your belonging in the Israelite community, that came through the mother's side. So it didn't matter if a woman married an Egyptian, her children would still be Israelites. From the Egyptian perspective, it was the father's designation that really indicated who his children were. If the father was a slave, the children were going to be a slave. If the father was Egyptian, the children were going to be Egyptian. So there's kind of a misunderstanding of two communities that happens here. In any case, it's during this second proclamation, the death of the male children, that we get the rise of one of the best known biblical stories in the Torah, which is, of course, the story of Moses. So Moses was one of these male children who should have been put to death, but whose mother instead wraps him up in a blanket and puts him in a basket and sets him on down the Nile and kind of lets God or fate take care of the baby. And what happens is that the baby's basket washes ashore near the Pharaoh's palace, and the Pharaoh's daughter sees the baby, probably knows that this is the child of a slave, but chooses to adopt the child nonetheless. So this child, Moses, is raised alongside the heir to the throne of Egypt. So he becomes a part of, and yet not a part of, the pharaonic royal family. Moses grows to adulthood in this environment, and according to the Torah, when he gets to adulthood, he is overseeing labor, kind of keeping track and accounts for the Pharaoh, and he witnesses a Pharaoh overseer abusing an Israelite slave. And Moses, who probably knew that he was adopted from this Israelite community, grew very angry. And he confronted the Israelite overseer. They fought, and the overseer in that fight fell to his death. And Moses was immediately crippled with uncertainty, and he thought, regardless of why I did it, I've committed murder. And rather than stay and face those charges, Moses ran out into the countryside. So he left Egypt. And he roamed for a long time. He married into a nomadic family out there. But eventually his destiny came calling. And as the story tells us in the Torah, God calls to Moses via the burning bush and tells Moses that he's got to go back and he's got to lead God's people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So if we look at this image here, first of all, this is clearly not a Jewish image, but rather a Christian image, because in Judaism, you don't depict human figures. It's just not done. There's a prohibition against it. But you have a figure of Moses sitting here looking at the burning bush. A burning bush that, look at that, is suspiciously like Jesus. So again, indicates that this is in fact a Christian image. So Moses goes back, bargains with Pharaoh a little bit, and eventually earns the release of the Israelite slaves, and so leads them out of Egypt. And they travel through the desert, and they get lost in the desert, according to the Torah. And God wants to make sure that the Israelites really are committed to him. And at one point, God gives to Moses the rules for living a life that is what God wants. These rules, of course, form the foundation of Jewish legal codes, and this is the 10 Commandments. Now, many of us are familiar with the 10 Commandments, at least from a pop culture standpoint. And perhaps you even know that the very first commandment indicates belief in God specifically. But scholars are split as to whether the adoption of the 10 Commandments indicates that the Israelite community was in fact monotheistic at this point in time. And the reason that there is debate is because there's uncertainty as to how to translate that first commandment. You can translate it as "thou shalt have no other gods but me," and that certainly seems to indicate monotheism. I only believe in this God. But you can also translate the words as "thou shalt have no other gods before me," which seems to acknowledge or recognize the existence of other gods, just nobody who's as awesome as the God of the Israelites. So uncertainty as to whether the Israelites under Moses are truly monotheistic or not. Now, regardless, the Israelites that Moses led out of Egypt eventually do make it back to the Near East, and when they get there, they find, kind of to their surprise, that there are already people in their promised land. And, of course, this was obvious because not all the Israelites had gone down to Egypt. But now, the Israelites that had been in Egypt had a very different history, and understanding than those that had stayed behind in the Near East. And so there were clashes. Now, eventually, the Israelites are going to win in these wars, these battles, against the other remaining Israelites, as well as other peoples around the Near East. And they're going to establish a kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And a succession of kings are going to expand this kingdom. And eventually you're going to get kind of to the height of the kingdom, which is under Solomon. And it's Solomon who is really going to establish Jerusalem as the great capital of the kingdom of Israel, and who is going to, according to the Torah, build the great temple in worship of God. Now, an important thing to note is that for the Israelites of Solomon's time, the place to worship God was the temple at Jerusalem. You didn't worship God at a temple or a synagogue somewhere else. Synagogues were schools. They were places to go and learn about the Torah, but not places to go and worship God. That honor was reserved for the temple in Jerusalem. So Solomon's first temple is built, and this is now a place for Israelites from all across the kingdom of Israel to come and worship God through sacrifice, through prayer, using the priests to intercede for them with God. However, the Torah also tells us, and archaeological evidence seems to agree with this, there were shocks, wars to come. And the kingdom of Israel splits initially after Solomon's death, because Solomon's sons can't agree on how to coordinate the kingdom. And so it splits in two. And you have the kingdom of Israel in the north, with the capital established at Samaria, and the kingdom of Judah in the south, with the capital remaining at Jerusalem. But not too long after that, you have the expansion of Mesopotamian peoples. And first, they come in and they conquer the kingdom of Israel, trash it, and then require tribute from the Israelites. That happens in 722 BCE. And then later, the Babylonians expand. They conquer the Assyrian Empire, and they go down and they conquer the kingdom of Judah. This happens about 600 BCE. So Jerusalem is sacked by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians, unlike the Assyrians, they had a very unusual way of dealing with conquered people. Rather than allow conquered people to stay in their homeland, they removed them and moved them to other parts of the Babylonian Empire. And they did this so that they would be much less likely to revolt against the new government. For the Israelites, this time away from their kingdom, from their area, is known as the Babylonian captivity. It doesn't last for a terribly long time. It runs from about 597 to about 539 BCE, but it has some really serious implications for the history of Judaism. Now, basically, what most scholars agree is that during the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites come to codify, to really understand their religion, and it's for certain by this time that they are all monotheistic. So we know for sure that during the Babylonian captivity, any remaining polytheism is swept away. Everyone really does just believe in one God. So it's really after this point in time that scholars begin to call these people Jews. And of course, we continue to call them Jews to this day. Now, eventually, the Babylonians are themselves going to be captured, and this happens close to the end of the Babylonian captivity, and they are conquered by the Persians. And the Persians let the Jews go. They tell them that they can return to their homeland. So the Jews return to the Near East. They rebuild Jerusalem, and importantly, they rebuild Solomon's temple. So the temple ruins that stand in Jerusalem today are the ruins not of the first temple, of which remains have never been found, but rather the second temple. And given how tricky excavation is in Jerusalem, we may never find the remains of the first temple, if any do in fact exist. So if we look at the development of Judaism a little more closely, because this is the foundation for later Christianity and Islam, then we need to understand why the Jewish God was different from the other polytheistic gods that existed at this time. One of the reasons the Jewish God was different was that the Jewish God was a holy spiritual being who could assume a human form, but wasn't swept up in a human form. Now, if we think about the great pantheons of the Greek and Roman traditions, or the Mesopotamian tradition, all of these groups had gods who had very specific forms. I mean, think about the Egyptian gods who were kind of half animal, half human. The Jewish God was spiritual. He could assume any form he wanted, a burning bush, a tower of flame. He could assume a human form if he wanted, but he wasn't encaged by such a form. Additionally, the Jewish God determined fate. He was not subservient to it. If, again, we go back and we look at Mesopotamian polytheistic traditions or Greek theistic traditions, what we see is that even the gods have a fate. Even they do things because it is their fate or because it is their destiny. That's not how the Jewish God operated. He wrote the destiny. He determined it. So he wasn't subservient to it, and he didn't act like a human, kind of with the whims of his destiny. Finally, for the Jews, their God was the creator. Now, of course, lots of different religious traditions of the time believed in a creator God, but those same traditions also believed that the different elements of nature were the responsibilities of different gods. For the Jews, that wasn't the case. Their one God was responsible for creating all of nature, and as a result of that, all natural phenomena, from the thunder to the rain to the wind, all of it was attributable to God. So, for the Jews, this demythicizes nature. There's no need to believe in a wind god who moves the leaves, in a thunder god who's angry and so throws thunderbolts, in a lightning god who throws lightning bolts. None of that is necessary. But now they can explore nature, understand it, as a way to get to know God even better. And of course, a few more things. And this is just review from last year when you had world geography. For the Jews, their God was universal. You didn't have to believe in him, but he was still your God. So their God was everyone's God, and he was the same God for everyone. He also had introduced them to this concept of social justice, or what we might better understand as the Golden Rule. Again, that concept of the Golden Rule appears in lots of different religious traditions. The Jews had their own version, of course, which they adopted and believed in. And finally, we have really a unique idea, and that's one of individualism. In the Torah, in the book of Genesis, the very beginning of the Torah, God grants to all humans two gifts. The first is life, which is hugely important. There's a couple of different stories, in fact, about the origin of human life. And then he grants humans free will. He lets them choose. And this is why Eve and Adam are able to choose to disobey God, but of course they have to live with the consequences. And the same was true for every other person in God's world. Everyone had free will. Just because God existed and he was the same God for everyone didn't mean that you had to believe in him. You could choose not to believe. And therefore, you kind of were determining your own destiny one way or another. That's a very different idea of life when you compare it to basically what other ancient people believed at the time. Now, of course, the conquest of the Babylonians by the Persians didn't mean that the Jewish history was all perfect from then on. And in fact, with the rise of the Roman Empire, we have oppression of the Jewish people. The Romans, you see, really liked for everyone to believe that their emperors were gods, that they became gods at their death. And the Jews didn't agree with that because, again, they believed in only one God. So the Jews eventually revolted against the Romans. And the last of the great revolts was, in fact, the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 to 70 CE. The Romans responded to the Great Jewish Revolt, as we might expect, with overwhelming military force. And in reconquering Judea for the Roman Empire, they destroyed the Second Temple of Solomon. And so what we see standing in Jerusalem today are the remains of the temple as left by the Roman Empire, basically. Now, the Romans carried back the great treasures of the Second Temple. And so what you guys see here in this image is what is widely believed to be the menorah from the great temple, as well as other elements of Jewish practice. Now, this created a problem for the Jewish people because their temple was where they went to worship God, no matter where they lived in Judea. After the destruction of the temple, where exactly were they supposed to go to worship God? Well, what happened after the destruction of the Second Temple was that the Romans tried to disperse the Jewish population in the Near East so that there wouldn't be another revolt. And this is what was known as the Jewish diaspora, the movement of Jewish people across the Roman Empire. So this happens after 70 CE. And what we see, if you look at the map, is that you have quite a lot of Jewish communities who began to spread out basically along the Mediterranean as we might expect, coming to Greece, even coming to Italy, spreading across North Africa. The Jewish worship that develops after this time is called Rabbinic Judaism. So now that the temple doesn't exist and that Jews can't go to the temple grounds to worship God, now the synagogue does become a center for worship. So it transitions from being just a school to being a temple as well. And the rabbis, who had traditionally been teachers of the Torah, who had helped other Jews understand the Torah, now they become leaders of worship. So rather than just having one priestly group in the temple, now you've got many rabbis leading congregations in synagogues, all worshiping God. This is the kind of Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, that is practiced to this day. Now, the increasing tensions between the Roman Empire and the Jewish community also coincides with the birth of another of the great monotheistic traditions, Christianity. As most of you know, Christianity is a religion that revolves around the life and very specifically the death and believed resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth was born sometime around 4 BCE, and he was executed by the Roman state sometime around 30 CE. For the disciples, the apostles, the first believers in Jesus' message, they thought he was the Messiah. Now, it's important to note that the Messiah, the idea of a Messiah, is a long-held tradition in Jewish community. However, Jews believed that their Messiah was going to be a political leader, someone who was going to come and lift them from the oppression of the Roman Empire. Jesus believed himself a Messiah and spoke about that role, but he was a spiritual Messiah, someone who was going to come and instruct people on the right way to worship God. He talked specifically about how people had been led astray and needed to come back to the true worship of God. So he was a reformer, but in a spiritual sense, not a political one. And for this reason, many mainstream Jews didn't believe in his message. So only those who believed in his message followed him closely. Again, these were his apostles. And tradition holds that there were 12 early apostles, along with other disciples, including, for example, Mary, his mother, and a variety of other Marys who followed along with his group. Now, a quick note here about Jesus. As you might know, the Christmas story and the whole celebration of Christmas revolves around the birth of Jesus. He's born in Bethlehem, which, as you can see down here, is basically a suburb of Jerusalem at the time. However, he's raised in Nazareth. And look at where Nazareth is. It's actually in Samaria. So if we go back in Jewish history, the Samaritans were the people who were Israelites but didn't go to Egypt at all. So there was a disconnect between the communities in the northern part of Judea, where Jesus was raised, and those in the southern part of Judea. And as you might imagine, much of Jesus' ministry happens in Samaria, in the northern part of this territory in Galilee, not in Judea. And so mainstream Jews didn't really agree with his message because they weren't really from his community. They were from a separate community. Now, Jesus spends about 3 years of his life in ministry, talking about his reform of Jewish theology, but eventually he runs against the Jewish leadership as well as the leadership of the Roman Empire, and he's arrested and he's put to death. He's executed in Jerusalem. Now, upon his execution, of course, Jesus' apostles and disciples kind of scatter a little bit. They're not really sure what to make of this. But in the stories of the Bible, it is believed by his apostles that he rises from the dead. And this fulfills a prophecy from the Jewish biblical tradition, from the Torah and the associated Jewish readings. Now, when Jesus returns, he talks to his apostles and he gives them all sorts of messages on what they're supposed to do. And they're supposed to continue the work that Jesus began, his ministry in reforming the Jewish theology. And what he specifically tells them to do is to evangelize. In other words, to go out into the world and spread the good news, this good news about the reform of Judaism. So Jesus' apostles, his disciples, become missionaries. And part of their job and part of the vocation of Christians is to go out and spread this good news. Now, initially, when Jesus' apostles went to do this, they did this in Jewish communities. So they really kept a close eye on people who were like them, who had the same culture, who spoke the same language, and they tried to reform Jews inform them about Christianity. It was a Jew who initially persecuted Christians, Paul of Tarsus, who came to realize that these Christians had to change their focus. And rather than just look at Jewish communities, they need to take the message of Jesus out to non-Jews, in other words, to Gentiles. And so under Paul of Tarsus, we get this great expansion of the missionary work of Christians, not just in the Near East, but really across the Mediterranean as a whole. So over time, in the first couple of centuries of the diffusion of Christianity, what we see is that Christian communities develop organization. And as they get larger, you need this organization to help maintain these Christian congregations. So just like Jews have a clergy, and that is the rabbi, the Christians develop a separate clergy system. Their priests are the leaders of worship, and priests who look after larger territories, so multiple cities, are known as bishops. And then priests also have as helpers deacons. People who don't necessarily lead worship but might lead prayer, certainly help the priest coordinate work, especially welfare work, within their congregations. What we see throughout the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries is the diffusion of Christianity across the Roman Empire, mostly along trade routes. Now, this is in the face of persecution from the Roman Empire, especially in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. However, by the time we get to the 300s, the 4th century CE, we have a shift. By this point in time, we have lots of Christians in the Roman Empire, and they're a kind of vocal minority. And at that point in time, the emperor of the Roman Empire, whose name was Constantine the Great, is curious about Christianity, in part because his mother is a Christian and he's heard a lot about it, and he believes that the Christian God gave him a leg up in fighting for the Roman Empire and, in fact, winning the imperial crown. However, he hears lots of different things about Christianity, one thing from his mother, something else from different priests, and he wants to standardize the beliefs and traditions of Christianity. So in 325, he calls together a meeting of the great leadership of the Christian church. This meeting meets at Nicaea, so this is known as the Council of Nicaea. And the Council of Nicaea gets together and determines a number of things that were kind of in disagreement across all of the Christian world. So importantly, they determine the divinity of Jesus. What they say is that Christians believe in a God who is 3 persons in one. So this is a trinity. There is God the Father, there is God the Son, and there is God the Holy Spirit. It's confusing. It's a mystery, and it is one of the mysteries of faith for Christians. They also agree to a statement of faith, which becomes known as the Nicene Creed. This is, of course, the Council of Nicaea. The Nicene Creed is recited to this day by Christian congregations, and in paragraph form, it gives the basic tenets of the Christian tradition. For those of you who are Christian, this is the prayer that begins, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. And then there's a different paragraph that talks about, I believe in the Son, Jesus Christ. There's another paragraph that talks about the Holy Spirit. And then finally, there is a paragraph that talks about the universal church, baptism, the resurrection, etc. So these are very simple ways to understand what the basic ideas of Christianity were. And finally, the Council of Nicaea begins to put together the official books of Christian scripture. Which of the books of the apostles are going to be part of the Christian Bible? Which other texts are also going to be part of the Christian Bible? Now, the Bible itself isn't going to be set for another few decades, but they begin the process. And what happens after the Council of Nicaea is basically that Christianity standardizes. And once you have the standardization of a tradition, now you can get its diffusion, right? The same thing would have happened with Judaism if Jews were evangelists, but they weren't. The Jews did not have that missionizing effort as part of their religious tradition. But Christians did, because this was part of the message that Jesus had given them. So now that there was a standardization of faith, all of these Christian missionaries could go out and say, hey, this is what we believe. This is the prayer that you can say. These are the texts that you can learn about. And that made diffusion of Christianity much, much easier. By 380, Christianity had become the state religion of the Roman Empire. Now, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the focus of really cultured living went east, and it was centered around Constantinople. And that part of the Roman Empire, the eastern part, becomes known as the Byzantine Empire. And that is kind of seen as a heart of the Christian world. The emperors of the Byzantine Empire very much saw themselves in the tradition of Constantine the Great, having to protect the church, having to support missionaries who are going out to bring the news of Christianity to other people. And as you guys can see on the map, the people that they're focusing on are those living in Europe, particularly in Western Europe, and then eventually to Central Europe as well. Well, finally, this time frame brings us to the development of Islam, which is the last of the great monotheistic traditions. As many of you know, Islam was founded by Muhammad. Now, Muhammad is, in Islamic tradition, the last great prophet of Islam, sent specifically by God, whom Muslims called Allah, to bring the revealed word of God. So Muslims believe in all of the prophets of the Jewish tradition, as well as great heroic figures of the Christian tradition, like Jesus, but believe that Muhammad comes and reforms those ideas, much the same way that Jesus believed he came and reformed Judaism. Muhammad's story is interesting because he's not one of these rich guys, kind of like Jesus, kind of from the lower end of society. And initially, when Muhammad is being called by God, he was, like Moses, kind of out in the desert and thought that he was just hearing things, maybe even going a little bit crazy. But when he shared that these voices were talking to him with his wife and with close friends, they said, no, this is God speaking to you. You need to listen to what God has to say. And eventually, what was revealed to Muhammad was God's last great blessing to humanity, which is the Quran, the eventually written down and published verses which God revealed to Muhammad. Over the course of Muhammad's life, he would travel and sometimes fight to see the expansion of Islam. Now, Muhammad was Arabian, originally from the Arabian Peninsula, and so much of the early expansion, diffusion of Islam takes place on the Arabian Peninsula. Cities of great importance to Muslims include Mecca and Medina, which are really the two great cities to first embrace Islam, but also Jerusalem, because Muslims believe that Muhammad took a trip to Jerusalem and from Jerusalem went up to visit heaven. And so Jerusalem also becomes an important holy city for Muslims. Now, when Muhammad was alive, he helped to coordinate the expansion, the diffusion of Islam. And so what you see on the maps, on this map here at the top, is kind of the direction of Islam's movement, right? Initially kind of located right here along the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, but eventually moving along trade routes across the Arabian Peninsula and eventually up into the northern part of the Middle East. Muhammad dies in 632. And when he dies, he does leave a gap because Muhammad as leader was both a political leader and a spiritual leader. But now, with his death, something else needed to occur. Somebody else needed to rise up to the challenge. So Muhammad is buried with great pomp and circumstance. In fact, here is Muhammad's tomb. And then his followers have to get together and figure out what to do. One of the things they decide to do is eventually to create clergy for spiritual growth. And so the clergy for Muslims are the imams, known as the imams. But Muslims, of course, also need a political leader. And so what happens is those men who take over after Muhammad as political leaders of the Muslims come to be known as Khalifa or caliphs. And so their state is known as a caliphate. And what we see on this map down here at the bottom right is the expansion of the caliphate. Throughout the course of Muhammad's life, we basically have the expansion of Islam through the Arabian Peninsula. After his death, we see it spread to the Middle East and North Africa, and then in the later period across North Africa and even up into Europe, as well as over to Central Asia. Now, eventually, as we see in pretty much every kingdom that has ever existed, dynasties form. within the caliphates. And the first few leaders after Muhammad were those people who were directly related to Muhammad. They were his cousins, they were his brothers-in-law, sons-in-law, etc. But eventually, the clan of one of these men takes charge and decides that they are the true leaders of the Muslim people. And so they establish a caliphate called the Umayyad Caliphate that is going to last from 661 to 750. Rather than maintain the center of the caliphate in the Arabian Peninsula, they shifted to Damascus because the Umayyads were traders and Damascus was one of their main trading cities. So the Umayyad Caliphate is Syria-focused. Its heartland is in Syria. Now, of course, when this clan took over as the dynastic force within the caliphate, it caused problems because not everybody agreed that that clan should continue to rule the caliphate. And so what occurred was a civil war within the Muslim community. And it was this civil war that gave birth to the two denominations, the first two denominations of Islam. You had the Shia, who believed that only direct descendants of Muhammad should rule, and therefore they believed that Ali, who was one of Muhammad's sons-in-law, should have been the rightful ruler of the caliphate after Muhammad's death. On the other hand, you had the Sunni, who believed that just a righteous person could lead the Muslim community, and all that mattered was that the majority of Muslims agreed that this person should be their leader. So the Shia are going to kind of forever be in a struggle against the Sunni, and eventually the Shia are going to really kind of isolate themselves in the Middle East around modern-day Iran and Iraq, whereas Sunnis are going to expand pretty much around the world. Now, one of the great hallmarks of the expansion of Islam during this time period is Islam's introduction to Europe. And what happens is in the year 711, the Umayyad Caliphates give the go-ahead for the leaders of the armies in northern Africa to attempt an invasion of modern-day Spain. So coming across the northern African plains here, they cross the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain, and they challenge the Visigothic kingdom of Spain that existed there at the time, and in fact push the kingdom all the way to northern Spain and then take over much of the Hispanic peninsula. They establish there a province which comes known as Al-Andalus. Eventually, Al-Andalus will on its own be a kind of small caliphate within the Muslim world. But it indicates just how quickly Islam spread, keeping in mind that Muhammad again dies in 632. By 711, they're knocking down the doors in Europe and establishing a political state in Europe. So the diffusion of Islam happened very, very quickly. And so again, if we consider the diffusion of each of these religions, how did it happen so quickly? We come back to the importance of the trade routes, because without the trade routes, you wouldn't have had an easy way for people to shift not just products but ideas. And when we look at the spread of Judaism or the spread of Christianity or the spread of Islam, this diffusion all happens along the trade routes. If we look here at this first map and look at the movement of Jews across the Mediterranean and then into Europe, what we see is that they're traveling along roads and sea routes across the Mediterranean. Eventually, they will travel north into the rest of Europe along regular trading routes and then move around in Europe along regular trading routes. If we look at the spread of Christianity, and this map also gives you the bonus of looking at the spread of Buddhism, you basically see the spread towards the west taking a very similar route to what the Jewish diffusion did, but the routes going east are basically going along the Silk Roads. So without the Silk Road being in place, neither Christianity nor in fact Buddhism would have spread all the way to the Far East. And again, it's the same story with Islam. They're taking advantage of the Mediterranean routes that exist, advantage of the Silk Roads which exist, and then eventually, because the expansion of Islam comes along when it does, they can take advantage of the gold salt trade routes in northern Africa as well and bring Islam to African peoples in West Africa. So as a quick review, the major trade routes that existed that linked the old world together, These were the routes that allowed for the diffusion of the great monotheistic traditions. You have the Silk Road, shown here in red, across Asia and connecting to Europe. You have the Mediterranean routes, shown here in purple, connecting Europe and North Africa. You had the trans-Saharan trade routes, which connected North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, shown there in yellow. And then you had the Indian Ocean routes, which linked all of the lands that are around the Indian Ocean, shown in blue, everything across Eastern Africa, everything across South Asia, and even into the Far East. So this amazing extent of roadway, whether that was on land or by sea, really allowed for the movement of products and people, but very specifically also allowed for the movement of ideas.